Hello, welcome to the last keynote. My name is Simon Gechter. I have the pleasure and the honor to chair today's Hahn lecture, plenary, keynote by Botond Kőszegi from Budapest. Botond is a real star in behavioral economics, I would say. So he is a leading figure in a field called behavioral economic theory, incorporating what we have learned from lots of experiments in economics and psychology about human behavior into theoretical models that we as economists recognize. Botond studied mathematics at Harvard, then did a PhD at MIT, moved to Berkeley up the ranks to professor, then went to Budapest in 2012, where he has been since. He's a professor there, university professor. He has published in all the top journals with very influential papers that are on many people's reading list, including mine, of those who teach behavioral economics, one sort or the other. What's interesting about his research also is that he integrates psychology into formal models, or psychological insights into formal models. We will see an example of this today, I suppose. But it's also, his theoretical work has inspired experimentalists like myself and many others to study, for example, the reference-dependent preferences. Some of the really important insights, seminal papers by his and Matt Rabin about reference-dependent preferences is a real achievement, also because it has inspired new experiments. So we have a dialogue, as in other sciences, between experiments, behavioral insights, and theory, and back and forth. So looking forward to your lecture. The floor is yours. Welcome to Botond Kőszegi.
Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. Today I'm going to tell you about a paper that's joined with Paul Heithus and Johannes Jonen. And the paper is about the industrial organization of products that are complex or complexly priced, in the sense that they are difficult for most consumers to understand or fully evaluate. And I think it's fair to say that many consumer products sold nowadays are complex in this sense. Just to give you two large categories of examples, it's difficult for many consumers to understand the technical properties of physical products, say cars, like how a car's brake works or how safe it is. And it's also difficult for most of us to understand the pricing or the contractual restrictions of many financial products and services, for example, an exotic mortgage, a non-standard mortgage, or something like that. So there are many questions that one can ask about these complex or complexly priced products, and that researchers, including ourselves, have asked. Just to get to the main point of the paper immediately, we are going to identify and study in a little bit of detail what we think is a powerful competition policy-based, so pro-market, argument for regulating secondary features, the difficult to understand secondary features of these products. So let me give you kind of the main idea and then show you how our model works. So the premise of our argument is I hope manifestly obvious observation, which is that consumers' attention is limited, so people have limited cognitive capacity, and therefore they pick and choose what aspects of their economic environment to pay attention to. So we think this applies particularly well to complex or complexly priced products, because people must decide how much attention to devote to each product that they purchase or that they may want to purchase. So for example, let's say a mobile phone buyer could look at a mobile phone contract just a little bit and quickly see what the monthly price is and what the amount of included data is, for example. But that's not everything there is to know about the contract. If she wants to know the exact restrictions, when she can use the phone, or additional fees, or potential traps in the contract, or whatever, then she has to look more carefully, which requires more effort or attention. Okay, so when consumers face such a situation, and the consumers have limited attention, then that leads to a trade-off, which is that they could either superficially look at more products, we call that browsing, or they could look more carefully at fewer products. We call that studying. So with this premise in mind, let me just note that there are already many regulations, or at least in developed countries, there are already many regulations in place. For example, extra fees for credit cards and mobile phones are regulated in many countries. The safety of our food and water supply is heavily regulated. Safety of consumer durables is regulated. Working conditions of jobs are regulated, and so on. Okay. So now let's ask, using our perspective, from our perspective, what would happen if these regulations weren't in place, but still there were disclosure regulations, so firms would only have to disclose the safety of a consumer durable or whatever, but there weren't regulations on the safety. Well, consumers, if there weren't regulations, consumers would have to worry more about what they're getting, and then they would have to study these products more to make sure that they're not getting something they don't want. And given this trade-off that I just mentioned between browsing and studying, that would mean that they would have less attention left to browse and compare different offers of different firms. And because it is comparison shopping that leads to competition, there would be then less competition and worse functioning markets. That's the basic idea, simple idea. So this, of course, contrasts with the classical view that regulations create distortions and make markets work worse in a sense. So from our perspective, it could be the case that it is regulation that makes markets in the developed world function, relatively well relative to other places. So, regulation of our water supply is not a distortion. It liberates us to worry about other things than what water we are drinking. And a little bit more of a behavioral perspective. This also contrasts with kind of a common argument against consumer protection and other kinds of regulations aimed at improving individuals' decisions. Basically, the idea is if we put in place regulations that help consumers make better decisions, then they don't have the incentive to learn how to make good decisions by themselves, and that will lead to kind of a negative side effect. It will backfire, could be bad in the end. Our point basically reverses this. We are saying if you do the right regulation that actually liberates consumers and they can pay attention to other things, and that leads to better functioning markets, not worse functioning markets. So there's a positive side effect. There's kind of a multiplier. Okay, so that's, we think of this regulatory stuff as the main implication, but beyond that there are some positive predictions of the framework as well. So we think the paper ties in nicely to this first set of observations on the low-income, on the shopping behavior of low-income consumers. So a variety of evidence, I mean a lot of it is survey evidence, anecdotal evidence and so on, but also some behavioral evidence indicates that low-income consumers engage in a lot of types of behavior that we would, using our model, we would interpret as studying. So trying to look at carefully at their individual purchases or potential purchases. So low-income consumers visit the supermarket more often and collect coupons and to obtain lower prices on the same items. They use money orders to avoid bank overdraft charges, and they use prepaid mobile phones to avoid exorbitant bills, so bill shock. So we show in our model that this often emerges as rational equilibrium behavior for low-income consumers whom we equate with low-value consumers, simply because it's the price-minimizing strategy given the constraints they have, attention constraints the consumers have. So for high-income consumers, it's either not so important to save money, it's not so important for them to save money at the supermarket, or it's easier for them to save money, for example, because, they always have quite a bit of money on their bank account and therefore they don't incur overdraft charges. Okay, so studying in this sense is often the rational behavior for low-income consumers, and in some markets, such as supermarkets, for example, it may lead them to pay less money for the same items at the same store than high-income consumers, living in the same neighborhood. But again, studying isn't comparative, so it involves saving money at individual sellers. It doesn't involve comparing sellers, so it's not comparison shopping. So it doesn't induce competition between firms. So that means that the average prices that consumers pay can be, under some circumstances, higher when the share of low-income consumers is higher. So, and this is consistent with evidence that some essential products are more expensive in lower-income neighborhoods. We don't want to push this too hard as necessarily the explanation, but we suggest it could have something to do with it. So just to mention the related literature very quickly. So this is related to three kind of literatures. The first one, the closest one perhaps, is Bounded Irrational Consumers in Markets. So there, much of the literature assumes that the way consumers search is exogenously given, whereas here a very important part of the argument is that what search consumers do is endogenous. So it depends on the economic environment and the regulations in place and so on. There are some exceptions to that, but very few. Okay, the paper is also related to the literature on search, which typically assumes like there's a huge literature on search, and I'm sure we missed many papers, but the overwhelming majority of papers assumes that once a consumer decides to search a product, it may be costly and she may decide not to do it, but if she does it, then she comes to understand the product perfectly. The literature also usually assumes that the search costs are linear and that the search procedure is exogenous. For our point, it's important to relax all three of these at the same time. There are some papers that have relaxed them one by one, but not in this way. And then the paper is also related to the literature on rational inattention, kind of a quickly growing literature, where the basic idea is that when people make decisions on how to allocate their decisions, they do so strategically. So again, it's the same idea that attention is limited, and so people strategically use their limited attention on the most important things. But there, most of the literature that assumes that the uncertainty that people seek to understand with their limited attention is exogenously given, and here for us it's important that it's generated by firms in interaction with policies by a social planner or whatever. Okay, so at the risk of being a bit repetitive, I'm going to give you a simple formal example on just to illustrate the main force in our model. Okay, and then I'll move on to a more complicated version of the model to be able to say a bit more. Okay. So suppose there are two firms, and in the paper we consider more, but here for the talk I'll always just consider 2. So there are 2 firms and they're selling a homogeneous product with marginal cost C. And each firm chooses 2 prices, a headline price and an additional price. So think of the headline price as something that's, upon superficial inspection pretty obvious, and the additional price is not so, something that's not so obvious. So firms choose 2 prices, and consumers purchase at most 1 product, valuing it at V greater than C, so it's a good thing to buy it. And if a consumer purchases product I, then she pays Fi plus Ai. So basically, she pays both prices. The additional price is not avoidable. Examples of this would be like the safety or energy efficiency of a product. So if you buy an unsafe product, it's difficult, or energy inefficient product, and you're going to use the product, it's difficult to avoid that. The cell phone example I gave there, maybe other charges may be avoidable. We'll cover that in the other model. Okay, so if you choose product I, you pay Fi plus Ai. So far this is basically a, pricing game with Bertrand type pricing game with homogeneous products. So now come the key assumptions on what consumers understand, the assumptions about limited attention or limited search. Okay, so each consumer automatically sees F1 or F2 with equal probability. And then a consumer who sees Fi can either see, so that's the one firm's headline price. A consumer who sees one firm's headline price can either see the other firm's headline price, or she can see her firm's additional price for free, and then she cannot observe anything else. So we are capturing this limited attention aspect of the consumers and the trade-off between browsing and studying in a very stark way. And you can only buy from firm I if you saw that firm's headline price. So you have to find that firm basically. Okay, and we are going to look for a perfect Bayesian equilibrium, and we are going to make one equilibrium selection assumption, which is that some consumers, at least could be an arbitrarily small proportion, but that some consumers browse. So is that clear? Okay. So then, this is a very simple model. In this model, in any equilibrium, despite having Bertrand type price competition, in any equilibrium, a consumer can only buy at her value. So basically, the firms become monopolists or local monopolists. And this is simple. The intuition is very simple, and proving this is quite simple. Basically, if any consumer just browsed and then bought, then the firm could raise the additional price on her to an arbitrary extent. So the firm would make infinite profits, and the consumer negative infinite utility, so that's just not possible. So in short, the consumers must be studying in order to protect themselves against price gouging. Since everybody who buys must be studying, they have no capacity left to comparison shop, so we get a monopoly. Like, consumers cannot look at more products, we get a monopoly. Okay? So that's the basic situation. And now note, okay, lots of people have asked me about price comparison websites. I mean, we don't fully analyze their effects, but in this situation, a price comparison website that only compares headline prices is not going to help you at all. And we think that's the right interpretation of many price comparison sites. So you get some cheap price quoted on the price comparison sites, but then other stuff could be added once you visit the actual store. Here, it won't help you at all, because if you can only study one product, then the one you study is the monopolist. They can charge you their value. Okay, so that's the baseline situation. Now, let's introduce a regulation. Okay, so take a symmetric equilibrium in this model in which, so there are many equilibria consistent with this proposition. Let's take one, simple one, symmetric pure strategy equilibrium in which firms charge FA, two prices FA, which sum to the consumer's value. And what happens in this equilibrium is browsing consumers definitely don't buy, everybody else is indifferent, let's just assume that they buy or whatever. Everyone else studies and buys. Okay, now impose, so here's the regulation, impose a regulatory cap, A bar, on the additional price, and just to make it interesting, let's assume that A bar is greater than the equilibrium additional price. So it's non-binding. So think of this as a minimum safety standard for products. Okay. I just want to emphasize that from a classical model in which from a classical model's perspective in which consumers know prices, or even in a search model in which consumers observe the full price of any search product, this price cap, so this regulation, would be irrelevant for not one but two reasons. One is that it's not binding, as I mentioned. Second, consumers pay F plus A, and you're only regulating A. So by regulating A, you haven't regulated the total price that consumers pay, which is the economically important price, in terms of consumers' purchases. And regulating part of the total price doesn't regulate the total price at all. So you think this is irrelevant. Even if it was binding, it would be irrelevant for this reason. Okay. But in our model, with this price cap, there is a unique equilibrium in which all consumers buy, and they do so at cost. So this regulation turns a monopolistic market into a perfectly competitive market. So this one is not so easy to prove at all, but the logic, the intuition is very explainable. So there are two parts, two channels that are important. So first of all, a price cap of this type makes browsing meaningful. So it can be meaningful to just browse. So without a price cap, any price cap on the additional price, any cut in the headline price can be undone with an increase in the additional price. So for someone who is just browsing, observing a cut in the headline price is a meaningless thing. Okay. Once there is a cap on the additional price, there are cuts in the headline price that cannot be fully undone. So browsing can be, seeing the headline price can be a meaningful signal of the total price, so browsing can be meaningful. And this actually is important for undermining this equilibrium here. So a firm could increase A to A bar and decrease F such that the total price is less than V by a little bit. And then browsers would understand that the price is less because they know that the additional price can't be above A bar. So this deviation attracts all the browsers, so it's a profitable deviation. Okay. So this is one channel that we think perhaps less important one, and the other one is, which you'll see over and over again in the talk, is that the regulation redirects search from studying to browsing. So now consumers can't be arbitrarily price gouged. Then it can be safe equilibrium behavior to browse. And once everybody is browsing, we get perfect competition. So this second channel supports the perfectly competitive equilibrium. And then we have to prove that there is nothing in between, but this is the logic basically. Okay, so just to drive home the logic and the main message a little bit more, note that a non-binding cap on the total price doesn't work at all. So if you put in a regulation that the total price cannot be more than some, I don't know, T-bar or whatever, but it's non-binding, so it's greater than V, that's not going to work at all, because it doesn't liberate consumers from looking at the additional price. You know, even if you have such a cap, the monopoly is still in equilibrium, and perfect competition is not. Okay, so it has to be the additional price, the secondary feature that you regulate. Regulating the what you would think is the economically more meaningful total price doesn't work. So you have to be regulating part of the price in order to liberate consumers to do comparison shopping. Okay, so this is an illustration. Now let me develop a model that's in many ways very similar, but it allows consumers to avoid the additional price, and it makes it a bit more complicated and leads to some additional predictions. Okay, so it's the same idea as before. There are two firms selling a homogeneous product, and again, each firm chooses a headline price and an additional price. And now I'm starting with the case where, you know, the additional price is capped. So this is kind of starting with the regulated market. So just to continue with this example of mobile phones, this FI could be, headline price could be the monthly fee, and AI, the charge for roaming extra minutes or whatever. Okay. In addition to these two prices, a firm also specifies conditions for avoiding the additional price. What are the conditions? So this is, you know, the conditions in the contract, the cell phone contract, specifying what usage is covered in the monthly fee. So in order to avoid additional charges, you have to satisfy these conditions. And if you buy, so if you buy firm I's product, then you definitely pay the headline price FI, and in addition to that, you choose a usage pattern, gamma wiggle, and you pay AI if your usage pattern is not equal to the conditions specified in the contract for avoiding the additional price. So this is how consumers can avoid the additional price. And now I'm going to bring in the different types of consumers we think of as low income, high income. So low value consumers who have a share alpha, they have a valuation of VL for the product, and they have zero cost of fulfilling any condition. High valuation consumers have VH and a high cost, greater than A bar cost of fulfilling almost any condition. So think of it as high value consumers. There's one specific way they want to use their phone, and they don't want to use it in any other way, and they're willing to pay for that. For low income consumers, just to save money, they're more willing to abide by conditions. That's what we capture with these assumptions. Okay. Consumer search is very similar to before, so each consumer sees one of the headline prices with equal probability, and then if she has seen a headline price, she can see either the other headline price that's browsing or her firm's additional price and condition. And that's studying and can't observe anything else and can only buy from firm I if she saw FI. And again, we look for perfect Bayesian equilibrium with 2 mild equilibrium selection assumptions that you can ask me over dinner. Kind of technical. We assume something similar that high value consumers browse and a more technical assumption. Okay. So as you can see, this is a very stylized model with very particular assumptions. It's one way of writing down this trade-off between browsing and studying. So I think it fits quite well the cell phone applications, but not other applications we have in mind. So we thought a lot about alternative modeling assumptions, and we basically argue or formally show that they don't change our basic message regarding either the regulations or this stuff about high value versus low value consumers' behavior. So you could assume that, in our model, we assume that studying is aimed at understanding how to avoid the additional price. So studying the cell phone contract to see what you need to do to avoid extra charges. It could be aimed directly at avoiding the additional price, even if you already know how to avoid it, like using a money order instead of check. Probably everybody knows it. Or collecting coupons, everybody knows how to do it. You just have to do it in order to save money. So that's essentially equivalent model. We assume that you can only see 2 prices in our model. We can assume that you can see more at an increasing marginal cost. That's basically the same model. Now, so in our model, consumers are rational, and we do that to just show that that the results here don't hinge on naivete, but we'd be the first to acknowledge that many consumers are naive. So one particular, that's the next one. Okay, so let me say that first. So one particular way consumers could be naive is that even if they try to avoid the additional price, they don't manage to do so, or don't manage to do so fully. So for example, consumers might underestimate the credit card interest charges they will be charged. But it's important for our model that the consumers are not completely oblivious to the additional price, so they must be thinking that there is an additional price that I need to avoid. Okay. So then the previous one, sorry about that. So it could also be the case that high value consumers, whom we think of as usually high income consumers, they don't need to study to fulfill the conditions gamma I. So for example, having high income, they could easily pay their credit card bill every month, or they won't overdraw their bank account, so they will never incur overdraft fees and so on. Okay. And then it could also be the case that the trade-off between browsing and studying occurs at a higher level. So we assume that just a one-product market will study a multi-product market. I'll show you later. Okay. So that's the model. Okay. So let me give you the some properties in the of equilibrium. So first of all, firms charge the maximum additional price. Both firms. That's kind of simple to see. They don't really have any reason to charge a lower one. High value consumers will pay the highest possible additional price. Low value consumers will avoid any additional price and so on. If they know it, if they know how to avoid it. If they're browsing consumers, then they don't see the additional price, so you again, might as well charge the highest one. So firms charge the highest additional price. It's not so surprising. And then, since high-value consumers are willing to pay a high additional price, they don't want to, fulfill any conditions for avoiding the additional price, and they know that both firms are charging the maximum. They are going to browse and pay the additional price. They'll look for the cheaper headline price, but they'll browse. Because of that, they'll have to pay the additional price. Okay. Now, it's a little less obvious what low-value consumers do, because they will do whatever saves them more money. So it turns out that in equilibrium, they always study and avoid the additional price, because that's the way they can save more money. Let me try to give you an intuition for that. It's a tiny bit, it's tiny bit complicated, but let me try. So, okay. So suppose this wasn't the case, that low-value consumers were browsing for some prices. Then take the highest price that occurs in equilibrium for a firm, and at the highest headline price, if at that price low-value consumers chose to browse, then at that price both high and low-value consumers choose to browse. So that firm would lose all consumers to lower-priced competitors with probability 1. So it would make 0 profits. So the firm doesn't want to do that, doesn't want to charge such a high price. So it lowers its price until to a level where low-value consumers study. It lowers its price until low-value consumers can save more money by studying than by browsing. It's the basic idea. Okay. So now these two, this pattern of search behavior implies a central prediction, we think, that the average total price that consumers pay is increasing in the share of low-value consumers. Now this is not obvious at all. There are two effects. So low-value consumers pay less on average than high-value consumers because they don't pay the additional price. And in fact, it's more important for them to save money, so they must be paying less on average than high-value consumers. So if this means that if there are more low-value consumers, there is a direct effect that they're going to lower the average price. So that's the first effect. The second effect, though, is that low-value consumers don't comparison shop. Because of that, there is less competition, and because of that, because of this indirect effect, that the average price consumers pay is going to be higher. Okay, so we show in the paper that the second effect, indirect effect, always dominates the first direct effect. So this is where we think is kind of ties nicely into this these observations that products are often more expensive in lower income neighborhoods. Now again, I don't want to push this too hard because there could be other reasons for this. So products could be more expensive because the cost of doing business in a low income neighborhood is higher. So we don't know, it could be lower too, actually. So we don't want to push this too hard, and it doesn't always happen in our model. But let me just say that there is a little bit of evidence that's consistent with our mechanism based on the trade-off between studying and browsing. So first of all, researchers have noted that the higher prices in lower income neighborhoods occur partly because low income consumers do less comparison shopping. That's exactly that they are not browsing. But at the same time, other research has documented that lower income consumers obtain the same products at the same store cheaper than higher income consumers. Presumably because they take advantage of sales better. Okay. So then we consider the possibility of entry. You think, okay, if there are all these low-income neighborhoods where prices are high, one would hope that because therefore firms are making a large profit, one would hope there would be entry into the neighborhood and that would increase competition and lower prices after all. So this is, and policymakers have actually proposed this as both a puzzle and kind of a potential solution to the problem. So this argument is the correct one if consumers have full attention, but if consumers are not comparison shopping, then it's not clear that entry will help. So we consider this question and we show that when there are a lot of low-income consumers, low-value consumers in our model, then the incumbents are going to make a killing because these consumers are not comparison shopping, but entrants are going to make little profit, because exactly because the same reason that the consumers are not comparison shopping, and so they don't have a large incentive to enter, and if they do enter, then they actually raise prices. But I don't want to go through that in detail. I want to get back to this policy point. So let's think about different types of policies in this market. Okay. So recall that we had a cap, a bar on the additional price, and think of that as a regulatory cap that limits how much can be imposed on a consumer after a purchase. That's what we think of as an additional price and the regulation of it. So just as before, I mean, I did it in the reverse order, but just as before in the simple illustration, we asked this question. So we ask, what if there is no cap? And here, for simplicity, we assume that the high-value consumer's cost of avoiding the additional price is kind of large. Actually, not just, to be honest, not just for simplicity, also for tractability. So now we get the same thing as before. Without a cap, each firm becomes a monopolist, and in this case, there are two types of consumers now. It's a perfectly discriminating monopolist. So the firms will charge FI to low-value consumers and VH minus VL, so the difference between the values is the additional price, so both types of consumers pay their value for the product. Okay, so again, I don't want to push this too hard, but a potential example is subprime and exotic mortgages before recent regulations, so before the crisis induced new regulations in this market in the US. So if you look at that market, this subprime mortgage origination market, by conventional measures, you know, IO ways of thinking about, was this a competitive market? How concentrated was this market? It wasn't concentrated. It was a very competitive market. Lots of firms, and they weren't too big. But prices were very high in this market despite that, and Bargill argues that that was because pricing was too complex for consumers to compare products, so basically firms were just monopolists. Okay, so this in the I didn't show you the full equilibrium, but there was some competition in that with the cap, and that already relies on regulation. Okay, so now I'm going to show you another type of regulation, which on the surface is totally different, but it acts through the same channel of engaging consumer search, consumer attention better. So we call this opt-in regulation. So assume again a cap on the additional price. It's that context. And think of a kind of default regulation of creating a standardized product. So the social planner imposes a default set of conditions, gamma, that a consumer must fulfill to avoid the additional price. And it has to be a known default. So think of it, so formally, call it gamma d equals 0. So this is kind of standardized conditions that if a consumer fulfills, she avoids the additional price. So that's a plain vanilla type product or contract. And we can allow the firm to offer other things to consumers. That's why it's just a default. Firms can offer other things. So they can tell a consumer, okay, here are the default terms, but why don't you consider these other terms and sign these other terms? That's okay, so long as the consumer can refuse those other terms without reading them. So I think this is a very natural assumption. So with a standardized plain vanilla mortgage, the firm can offer the consumers, you know, the non-standardized 300-page contract with much more complicated terms, but the consumer can say, no thanks, I don't want to read that, I just refuse that, I'll go with the plain vanilla stuff. Okay, so in a sense, this is a very soft regulation. It's a kind of nudge. It's soft because fixing market prices and consumer search behavior, it doesn't change anything. Low value consumers avoid the additional price, high value consumers don't, and so on. Okay, but in our setting, it induces perfect competition by allowing low value consumers to just go with the plain vanilla terms. Then they can just browse rather than study, and that creates perfect competition again. So it again it works through this redirecting consumer search channel. Okay, so it's kind of an interesting part of this is that the standardization of the additional price is most beneficial for low value consumers, even though they don't pay the additional price. And that's because it helps them to avoid having to study and helps them find the cheaper product. Okay, so let me get back to this broader principle of that I started with. So essentially, the common message of these regulatory examples is that the regulation of secondary product features is often a pro-competitive thing. So I think you all understand this now. So if you simplify consumers' lives in the right way, they will do more comparison shopping, and that will have a beneficial indirect effect on the market. And this, of course, contrasts with the common presumption that product regulations, and especially contract regulations, create a deadweight loss. So especially, think about contract regulations especially. From an economic perspective, why are contracts written? They are written to overcome market failures. So why would you want to regulate something that's exactly created to overcome market failures? So here, from this perspective, it makes sense. And the contracts are heavily regulated. Okay. But it's so this is, in a sense, completely contrast with a common presumption or conclusion or whatever in economics. So, but it does have a bit of a precedent in development economics, actually. So I think in modern development economics, many would agree that a kind of a central problem in developing countries is that people face a very difficult decision environment, and that this is partly due to the lack of regulation. So in a sense, the lack of regulation in developing countries lowers economic freedom. Duflo has this great piece in which she puts it really powerfully. So let's take again water safety. That's what she uses. Water safety. So here, if you open the tap, you have no choice about what water will flow out of that tap. It will be expensive, clean water. I mean, relatively expensive. Now, in developing countries, that's not the case. There, people can choose between dirty, cheap water, or they can use some cleaner, and they can have more expensive and clean water for their family. From a classical perspective, this means that people in developing countries are more free. They have more economic freedom because they can trade off between the cleanliness and the price of the water. That's kind of the better situation. Now, Duflo says that it's completely crazy. We are more free because we don't have to worry about our water, and we can worry about other things. So that's in a sense where we are coming from. We are formalizing a version of Duflo's argument, let's say, and we are also showing that that's not just good for individuals, it's also good for markets. And this kind of, from this perspective, this suggests that regulation might be one reason that developed markets function better. Our results also contrast with the what I would call the nanny state concern regarding consumer protection and other consumer protecting regulations. The argument goes something like this: just like if you have if you have a baby and you have an overprotective nanny who protects the baby from everything obsessively, then the baby will not learn how to protect herself, and then she will get into a huge accident later, and that will in the end be worse. That's the nanny state concern. If we help consumers make better decisions, then they don't learn how to make better decisions by themselves, and that will backfire, will make it worse for consumers. So this is made, it's commonly, before when we wrote and presented papers on naive consumers, this was a regular question in seminars, it's in popular press, in law, and also in economics. This argument has been made. We totally reverse this. If consumers don't need to protect themselves from stuff, then they can pay attention to other things, and that leads to better outcomes. It doesn't backfire, it has a positive multiplier effect. Okay, so let me just, since we are in Britain, let me just compare our results, in particular to Armstrong, Vickers, and Zhu, who make a compelling case that price caps can backfire by lowering consumer attention. And their model is based on Firstman and Fishman from before. Okay, so a version of their model assumes that consumers, it's also a limited attention story, so consumers can be or costly attention story. Consumers can either choose in an uninformed way, so choose a product randomly, or by paying a cost, they can observe all the prices in the market. This will lead, in this situation, there will be relatively high prices because not everybody will choose to pay attention. Those who have a high cost won't choose to pay, will choose not to pay attention. Okay. So you think, let's try to protect consumers and put in a price cap. If you impose a price cap, that will decrease price dispersion in the market, and that will lower the benefits from getting informed, so fewer consumers will get informed. If fewer consumers get informed, there is less competition, so if this price cap is not too low, it increases the average price. It's pretty compelling, no? Also, except for the fact that it's exactly the opposite of our prediction. When we have a price cap, it lowers the average price, potentially from monopoly to perfect competition. With their price cap, it increases the average price. So what's going on? So we thought about this quite a bit. So it's actually not contradictory to our mechanism. First of all, we show in a version of our model that if you cap the headline price, then you get a similar effect to theirs. So capping the headline price is not a good idea. And kind of even ignoring that, suppose this Armstrong et al. Effect is operational in one market. If you cap the headline price, it increases the average price, but it also frees up some attention of consumers, and that could be useful in another market. So it could increase attention elsewhere. That could be good for other markets and then be beneficial overall. Okay, but so even so, the first point here is the more important one, that you don't want to cap the core. You don't want to interfere with the core price mechanism, so you don't want to interfere. You don't want to cap the headline price. Again, you want to regulate the secondary features, not the prime features of the product from this perspective. Okay, so let me just caution that I think you wouldn't expect this, but we don't intend to endorse indiscriminate regulation of every secondary feature. Classical concerns about regulations are missing from our model, and this would be useful to add it back to some extent to the model. But the right response to this recognition that kind of arguments against regulation are missing is not to look individually at each market and fine-tune each market depending on the costs of regulation in each market. From our perspective, we didn't formally work this out, but our perspective suggests that that's not the right response, because understanding, so we didn't formally work it out, we're planning to do so. Understanding policies also requires attention. So understanding what the policy is that pertains to different markets, consumers need to devote attention to that too, not just on product features. So if you replace complicated product features with complicated policies and always different policies regulating those features, then maybe you haven't helped consumers that much. They also have to look separately at every market. I mean, maybe it helps them a little bit, but not as much. Ideally, you'd want simple overarching principles that are relatively easy to understand and apply to a large set of situations. So that an example of this, we think, is the EU unfair contracts principle in standard terms contracts. So standard terms contracts are contracts that you don't negotiate, but you know when you go to your bank account, you go to your bank to open a bank account. They give you a contract and you can sign it or not. You can refuse it, but you cannot negotiate individual terms. Okay, so those are standard term contracts. Most contracts that consumers deal with are like that. So the EU unfair contracts principle in our understanding says something like that. Individual terms in these contracts cannot be too surprising relative to how things are normally done, and they cannot be too asymmetric to the detriment to the consumer. So this is exactly the kind of general legal principle that we think is consistent with our perspective. Now, it's phrased in terms of fairness, that it's unfair to include terms like that in the contract. We say it's not just about fairness, it's about making markets work better too. Okay, so let me quickly talk about what happens when there are multiple markets. So we consider an extension of the model where there are multiple markets of the same type. So there are n duopoly markets, just to see that how when consumers have more attention than just to look at one purchase, but they do have a binding attention constraint because they have many things to do in their lives. So we consider an extension of to multiple identical markets of that sort. So basically, consumers see one headline price in each market, and then they can search k other prices of their choice. It could be additional price, headline price, in any combination they want. But we assume that consumers need to buy in every market. Okay. So then we get the replication of the previous equilibrium, basically. So in each market there is going to be an equilibrium of the type we had in our single market. So that's kind of boring so far. The interesting part is what happens with regulation. So suppose that in J of these n markets, the social planner imposes this default regulation that I explained. So it imposes a known default of gamma d equals 0 as before in J of the n markets. What happens as we change as a function of J? Basically, if the regulation is relatively narrow, so it affects only a few markets, then the effect is positive, the effect of the regulation is positive, but it's limited. So what happens is that the regulation has the intended, if you regulate only a market or two, it has the intended direct benefit that low-value consumers can avoid the additional price in these markets. And because that frees up some of their attention, that has some indirect benefit in other markets. So they can study in other markets, so fewer consumers in other markets pay the additional price. So this is kind of important economic point, that if you do a regulation from a limited attention perspective, if you do a regulation and you don't see enough welfare effect in that market, that doesn't mean that it's not welfare increasing overall, because if you helped free up consumer attention, that could be beneficial in other markets and that could tip the scale. Okay, so there could be some benefit, but for a low number of regulated markets, there is no indirect benefit on competition. Now, if J is relatively large, then all of a sudden the market becomes perfectly competitive. So what happens then is that low-value consumers have enough attention to study all the markets they need, the unregulated ones, and they have some attention left to browse too. And once they are starting to browse, then competition ensues. So then all of a sudden all markets become perfectly competitive. So that means here that the benefit of regulation is highly nonlinear. If you just regulate a few markets, not much of an effect. If you regulate enough, all of a sudden things become much better. So this again strengthens the argument that we don't want one-by-one regulation, we want a broad regulation or legal principle or whatever. Okay, so let me stop here actually and just emphasize here at the end that we talk about competition in the paper. Often more competition makes things more efficient, but not always. So the results I talked about are about competition, not necessarily often, but not always about efficiency. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. We have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks for a very interesting talk indeed. I was thinking about the example that you use about safe drinking water, because when I go to less developed countries, I always make sure that either I use safe bottled water or I boil tap water. Here, I don't do that, which means if somehow my water supply gets contaminated, I get badly ill. Now, this doesn't happen a lot, but a couple of years ago, we had a case when people were buying beef products that turned out to be horse meat. And so essentially, if you have a firm that wants to cheat and sell something of substandard quality, if people don't study then they may end up buying something which potentially will be dangerous.
Yeah, so I totally agree that the regulation has to be effective. And if it's not effective, people can have a false sense of safety or something. And I think Armstrong talks about that in one of his papers, Mark Armstrong, basically saying that sometimes people assume that some charges are already regulated when they are actually not yet regulated. So I think this reinforces his point that the regulation has to be broad, and it might be tough for a developing country to do this kind of regulation because they can't do the kind of broad thing that gives a sense of safety but also satisfies that sense of safety.
Your argument is very interesting in the UK context because we've had a liberalised retail home energy market, and the features of that market have very closely followed what you've been describing, where we have very complex tariffs. Poorer households tend to make bad choices and go on to expensive tariffs, whereas rich people shop around and get a better deal. Now, the competition authorities have generally fought against the idea of price caps, saying it would impede competition and that would make everyone worse off. Until recently, the government has now said we are going to cap the default tariff that people will be on. When people come off a contract, they're going to cap the default. It sounds like that's similar to what, inadvertently similar to what you're recommending. Would that be a correct interpretation, or have I got that wrong?
Sorry, say that again. What's the default?
So the standard variable tariff, which people will come onto when their contract ends, their timed contract ends, will be capped. So it will rise. It won't rise more than a certain level. They haven't set the level, but that is in order to protect the poorer people who don't shop around.
Okay, so every year the contract gets renewed, but it resets to a default if the consumer didn't make a choice?
Yeah, the typical contract would be for 1 or 2 years. Yeah. What happens at the moment, people come off those contracts and then they go on to their energy provider's standard variable tariff. And what the government has done to protect people, the standard variable tariff is much more expensive than the other tariffs which are on offer, but poorer people don't tend to choose the shop around for the cheaper tariffs, so they go on a more expensive tariff.
Yeah, we'd have to think about it. It's not an exact match, so what the new contract that you get moved into if you don't pay attention could be an additional price, but the main thing that they're doing sounds like regulating the core price, so I'm not sure how well it fits. I would have to think about that. Sorry about that.
Another question? In the middle.
So in your model, the sort of total amount of searching that people do, browsing plus studying, is fixed. Right?
Yeah.
So whereas you might hope that there would be some sort of marginal cost, like increasing marginal cost of that. Do you think your results will hold if you have that under some conditions?
Yeah. So we considered that not in the multi-market model, but the basic one. We assumed that you can see 2 prices for free, and then you can see additional prices at an increasing marginal cost. It doesn't change anything. It basically leaves the structure of the equilibrium the same, except for the fact that the cost of observing the third price affects the level of prices. So, I mean, I can tell you more exactly how the equilibrium works and why that is afterwards if you want. But it basically affects the level of prices, but not the structure of the equilibrium or, the comparative static with respect to the share of low-value consumers and so on.
One last question, maybe.
Hi. So in your model, the firms have only the strategy of charging the prices, but their strategies in real market is that they basically invent these add-ons and they keep inventing new ones, and that's how they make money through these methods. So in some sense, shouldn't the principle be regulating firms' ability to tax consumers' attention in a general framework?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, you're absolutely right that firms invent new and new ways of charging additional prices, and in order for the regulation to work, is somehow the regulator must be able to prevent the firm from just replacing the old additional price with a new one. Now, our model also says that this practice of inventing new and new additional prices is extremely harmful because it dilutes consumers' attention. So if now there are two additional prices, some consumers will look at one versus the other, and both of them they're not going to be paying as much attention to, so that could harm market outcomes even further.
Okay, thank you very much for this fantastic lecture. One round of applause, please.